Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to the Sociology seminar series. Hiya. So it's a great privilege to have kind of two scholars who are really at the forefront of a lot of exciting class analysis. That we have Sam Friedman and Aaron Reeves with us here today. And they'll be discussing Born to Rule, the Making and Remaking of the British Elite, which was also the title of a book published by Harvard University Press last year. So Sam is Professor of Sociology at LSE and co-author of The Class Ceiling, Why It Pays to Be Privileged, and also author of Comedy and Distinction, The Cultural Currency of a Good Sense of Humour. He's also the co-editor of the British Journal of Sociology. And we also have Aaron with us, who is also a Professor of Sociology at LSE. And he's an award-winning sociologist who's conducted pioneering studies of health and social class. He is also a co-editor of the British Journal of Sociology. So I'll hand over to you, Sam and Aaron.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's lovely to be here with you. So I want to start with a very British phrase, complete rubbish. Henry, a recently retired corporate lawyer, was visibly offended. For nearly 2 hours, he had talked amiably about a highly successful career in the City of London. But now, fairly instantaneously, the atmosphere had changed. I had just asked him a question we put to nearly 150 people that we interviewed for this book. Do you consider yourself a member of the British elite? The frustration in his response, as you can see here, was palpable. Something, though, felt a bit incongruous about Henry's outrage. Maybe it's that we were sitting in the drawing room of his 7-bedroom townhouse in Bloomsbury. Maybe it was the fact that we knew his wealth extended beyond £10 million. Maybe it was the huge self-portrait of himself that hung opposite us as we talked. Or maybe it was something about Henry's background and life trajectory. His father held a very senior post in the civil service, as did his grandfather. He went to one of Britain's most elite schools. He attended Oxford. And for more than 30 years, Henry had been a senior partner at a Magic Circle law firm. Or maybe it was just that as we spoke, and despite his protestations otherwise, it became abundantly clear that Henry was actually hugely influential. His personal networks included the Governor of the Bank of England, a former Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he spoke of various times in his career where he had levered his position to lobby government ministers. I should stress, and I think it's important to say, it's not that Henry was arrogant or pompous. On the contrary, he was positively charming and thoughtful throughout. But to us, at least, he seemed to be the embodiment of the British elite, both in origin and in destination. But clearly, and like the vast majority of people that we spoke to for this book, this is not how Henry saw himself. He rejected the idea that privilege had had any significant role in his success. He talked up his working class ancestors. He belittled his influence. And he presented himself more generally as a kind of exemplar of a more meritocratic era, both in the City of London and in Britain more generally. But what we want to argue today is that there is a dangerous disconnect between how elites like Henry see themselves and what we discern when we carefully analyse patterns of elite reproduction in this country over the last 125 years. In many ways, we're going to try and show the British elite hasn't changed a lot. It continues to be an incredibly socially exclusive formation. And this matters because it has important implications for the elites we get. Not only are we going to show do elites from privileged backgrounds tend to tilt to the right, politically and culturally, but these leanings are accentuated if, like Henry, elites combine positional power with extreme wealth. So why are elites like Henry so keen to convince us of their ordinariness? One answer we'll suggest is that recent rises in economic inequality, particularly the pulling away of those at the very top, have made people like Henry insecure about their moral legitimacy, sensitive to public concern that they are motivated unduly by economic self-interest. In this context, public expressions of ordinariness, in the way you tell your backstory, in the way you express your cultural tastes, in the way you articulate your meritocratic legitimacy, represent a logical strategy of impression management. And as we'll show in this sense, elites who successfully convince the general public that they have risen from humble origins or have mainstream cultural tastes are much more likely to be viewed sympathetically, as more relatable, as more intelligent, as more hardworking, and even to some extent as more competent. There is, in other words, we'll argue, a symbolic market for ordinariness. So that's our basic punchline of the book. Let me row back a bit now and tell you how we're going to get there, what questions underpin our analysis. So the overall project basically asks a fairly simple research question. How has Britain's elite changed over the last 125 years? And more specifically, we were interested in whether it's still dominated by this kind of caricatured idea of kind of wealthy public school boys. But we're also interested in whether it's marked by the same kind of culture as in the past, and also, crucially, whether this elite is a kind of coherent social formation. Does it think and behave in a particular way? Is it ideologically coherent? But of course, the thorny question that always has to start in this domain is, what are we actually talking about when we deploy a term like elite? I think popular interests in the notion of elites has never been higher. We hear it constantly bandied around in political discourse, both on the left and the right. But flanking this, as John Scott notes here, is often a kind of maddening conceptual fuzziness or slippage. And while we're at it, aren't we elite? Isn't this whole book a bit rich, coming from two white male professors working at the London School of Economics? The answer, no doubt, is yes. We're certainly aware that our positions act as exactly the kind of elite signal that we're trying to challenge or critique or interrogate here. And I think the truth is there is always going to be challenges in identifying the boundaries between who is and who isn't elite. But I think in this project, what we wanted to try to do is employ a conceptually coherent and temporally consistent definition. So in this way, the primary conception we use in the project is who's who. Now, this is the leading biographical dictionary of noteworthy and influential people in the UK. It's been published in its current form every year since 1897 and has consistently represented about 0.05% of the UK population. So currently that means about 33,000 entrants. We would also argue that Who's Who is fairly coherent conceptually, in the sense that it primarily documents an elite based on position. So in this way, around half of the people in Who's Who are included actually automatically. So MPs, peers, judges, ambassadors, FTSE 100 CEOs, national newspaper editors, poet laureates, fellows of the British Academy are all included by virtue of their office. The other 50% are also, we would argue, positional elites, but they are selected based on their reputation. So there's a board of long-standing advisors that make an assessment of an individual's kind of sustained professional impact on British society. But for many, Who's Who may still feel like a rather large group to constitute the British elite. This is perhaps the most well-known sociological definition of elites. It comes from Seamus Khan. He argues that elites are those with disproportionate access to and control over a range of economic, social, cultural, and political resources. I think the point, I suppose, to note about Who's Who is that, to some extent, lots of the people in Who's Who have disproportionate access over cultural and political social resources, but perhaps in one domain largely. So what we were kind of interested in is the idea of trying to perhaps identify an elite within Who's Who that really capture this idea of a range of different kinds of resources. So reflecting on the classic elite theories of people like Marx, Pareto, C. Wright Mills, what we tried to do was identify those who have disproportionate control over both positional and economic power. Okay, so we defined what we call in the book as the British wealth elite, as those who are both positionally elite in the sense that they are included in Who's Who, and economically elite in the sense that they occupy the top 1% of the national wealth distribution. So our wealth elite that we're operationalizing here consists of about 6,000 people, and that's 0.01% of the UK population. How do we identify these people? Two ways. So historically, we're analysing probate records in the UK. That's the public record of people's wealth at death. We then match those people to Who's Who to identify those who are in the top 1% of the wealth distribution when they died. To identify today's wealth elite, we turn to a survey that we sent to people in the current version of Who's Who, where we asked them lots of different questions, and some of that will become clear as I go, but one of the questions was about their total wealth. So those are the two elite groups that we're working with here. What though is our kind of overarching research design? So there's a lot going on here, as you can see. We're marshalling both a range of quantitative data, and we're also trying to make that mixed methods with qualitative data and also longitudinal. So on the quantitative side, we have the entire historical catalogue of Who's Who. It's about 125,000 people. As I mentioned, we match that with probate records to try and understand wealth and its role both in people's origins and in terms of their destinations. We also have a survey that we sent out to current entrants of Who's Who, where we asked them a range of kind of attitudinal questions and demographic questions, as well as about wealth. We also have this interesting database on desert island discs, which we probably won't talk about today, but please do feel free to ask us about in questions. We also, as I said, wanted to make this mixed methods. So overall, we have 217 in-depth interviews. About 150 of those were carried out by ourselves and our postdocs. And we also have about 70 interviews that we took from the British Library National Life Stories series. And the idea was really to try to organise a qualitative longitudinal sample split into 4 birth cohorts to really sort of understand the experiences of people who have reached elite positions born at very different parts of the 20th century. Okay, so let's start with this issue of elite identity, this struggle to be ordinary that I mentioned at the start with Henry. So this came out in our data in a number of ways. First was via fairly basic responses to the question I talked about at the beginning that we posed, I should say, right at the end of interviews about whether people see themselves as part of the elite. So the vast majority of people strongly pushed back on this, as you can see with Samantha here. And I should say many did actually expressing quite a sort of strong sense of anger, even offence at that suggestion. I don't think that's particularly surprising. I think if you think about the way the term elite circulates in everyday life, it's almost invariably pejorative. It normally seems to sort of indicate a group with power that whoever's speaking sort of disagrees with. But I think this idea of sort of elite ordinariness also came out in more indirect ways too in our qualitative data. So one way in particular was via narratives of progression, narratives of opening up, that people were telling us in interviews that the elite world that they're part of used to be closed, right? Used to be socially exclusive, but basically things have changed. Things have become more meritocratic over time. This is Duncan, and he's sort of expressing here in terms of this idea of the old school tie, the power of boarding schools. Essentially, yep, that might have been a really important sort of marker in the past, but things have changed. I'm part of a new meritocratic era. Another way that ordinariness emerged was via kind of somewhat tortured discussions about class background, about people's origins, particularly actually among many that we interviewed from fairly unambiguously elite origins. So this was Victoria here, a celebrated professor with actually sort of aristocratic roots. And for many like Victoria, class background was a kind of distinctly uncomfortable topic. I think you can kind of see if you read this quote sort of how the sort of palpable sense of discomfort in trying to grapple with this question. And actually it was telling that in our survey sample, 43% of people who reported their class origin in the survey as working class actually had parents who had done solidly middle class professional or managerial work. And like Victoria, and this Victoria, many interviewees seem to sort of deflect from, downplay aspects of their upbringing in interviews that might signal eliteness. So this was via sometimes comparison with more advantaged peers that they might have encountered at school or in the workplace. Or sometimes it was by presenting their origin story via a kind of fairly elaborate extended family history. An extended family history that had a kind of upwardly mobile story to it, a sort of tale of meritocratic striving. One unusually frank conversation with Rachel, a charity CEO, I think illustrated this more contemporary sentiment. So Rachel had been educated at an elite boarding school, but actually she explained that throughout her career, she had actually sort of actively hidden her schooling from her colleagues in the workplace. She'd gone as far as to actually omit her schooling from her Who's Who profile. And I think overall, what we were seeing in interviews was a kind of instinctive sense that people wanted to tell us an upward story. They wanted to sort of claim a meritocratic legitimacy for their eliteness. And I think the reason that was interesting to us was that when we were looking at the interviews with elites done at the early part of the 20th century, we saw something really quite different. There was often this sense among these earlier generation of elites of a kind of self-conscious celebration of being upper class, of coming from a kind of elite origin and inhabiting that, proudly sort of parading it in interviews. This was Jeremy Morse, who was a university chancellor. These interviews are publicly available, so we haven't anonymized them. This was a discussion we had from him about the sort of role that inherited wealth had played in his upbringing. And you see the sort of breezy sense of comfort in which he describes this sort of insulation of family money. And, you know, that really contrasted very directly with the kind of tortured discussions we were hearing from people about class origins in the present. Why do we care about these expressions of ordinariness sociologically? I think the primary reason for us was that they seem to directly contradict, as I mentioned at the start, what we were finding quantitatively. So when it comes to the power of elite origins, public schooling, Oxford and Cambridge universities, there's actually been remarkable continuity over the last 125 years. And to take you through that, I'm going to pass on to Aaron.
So the first thing that we wanted to investigate and interrogate is this claim by our interviewees that Britain has opened up over time, that different kinds of people are able to get into these top positions. And the way that we do that is by drawing on the kind of data that Sam's already talked about. We tracked down the parents of the people in Who's Who, and we're able to observe the wealth at death of their parents, and we're able to observe that pattern over time. And what we find can be seen in this graph. So along the horizontal axis are different, it's kind of change over time, looking at the year at death of the parents of those people in Who's Who. On the vertical axis is the proportion of people that are born into different parts of the wealth distribution. So the solid black line at the bottom here is the proportion of people that are born into the top 1%. The blue line is those that are born into the top 10%. And I think the first thing to draw out of this is that with some movement among the top 10%, these trends have been relatively stable over time. There hasn't been a great deal of opening up, at least in terms of the wealth origins of the people in Who's Who. Now this is, I think, remarkable when you situate it against this figure. This is not from our data, this is from Alvarado and colleagues, but what this shows is the share of total wealth in the UK that's captured by the top 1%. And you can see here that it's declined a great deal since the beginning, of the 20th century. So there has been a kind of dramatic degree of equalisation in access to wealth, partly through, not only through, but partly through the expansion of home ownership, for example. So on the one hand, we're seeing a kind of radical equalisation. On the other, we're seeing this persistence of the ability of wealthy families to propel their kids into the elite. So as they've become relatively less wealthy, they've been able to continue to succeed in that respect. So coming back to this figure, what I think you can draw from this then is the sense that not only are families who are in the top 1% of the wealth distribution about 20 times more likely to see their kids show up in elite positions, but also the degree to which that's been durable over time. But wealth is not the only thing that's important to us in this analysis. Other elite institutions play or have played a crucial role in the formation of the British elite. And here we want to focus on prestigious public schools, and actually within that, an even smaller subset of elite British schools, the so-called Clarendon schools, named after a commission that focused on these particular schools in the middle of the 19th century. These are the schools that many of you would have heard of before: Eton, Harrow, Westminster, Rugby, Charterhouse, and others. And these have been described as the chief nurseries of the British elite. So we were intrigued. To what extent has the British elite come from these and other public schools? Well, that's contained in this graph. Again, on the horizontal axis, this is change over time. Here we're focusing on the year of birth of the people in Who's Who. And this black line at the bottom is the proportion of people in Who's Who born in different birth cohorts that went to these Clarendon schools. So as you can see, here the story is one of some decline. Right? At the beginning of our period, around 20%, 1 in 5 of the British elite went to one of those 9 schools. By the end, it's about 8-9%. You can see the trends for HMC schools are kind of what's considered public schools, kind of elite private schools, and then you have the rest of the independent sector at the very top. Now, this decline, I think, is important, but it also shouldn't be overstated. Because if you look among recent entries to Who's Who, which is what we captured in this figure, it doesn't seem that this decline is terminal. It's not that there's a continual falling away of these schools. Indeed, it seems to have flatlined through the 21st century. Indeed, today, the alumni of these Clarendon schools are still 52 times more likely to end up in these elite positions than anyone else in the British population. But there's also other schools that are operating in this kind of elite schools ecosystem. These Clarendon schools have historically been male-only schools. But we can also look at elite girls' schools in the British context, which are also trying to do the same kind of work, places like Cheltenham Ladies' College, for example. And what's striking here is that when you compare the alumni of the girls' schools to the alumni of the boys' schools, the girls' schools have been successful, for sure, but never as successful as these boys' schools compared to other boys and compared to other women. So they're relatively less powerful within the kind of ecosystem of the production of elite women. So after attending these schools, often you would move to a university. And 2 universities have loomed very large in this conversation, Oxford and Cambridge. And I think in this respect, there's been an assumption that very little has changed, that Oxford and Cambridge were and continue to be the kind of key institutional hubs through which elites move and operate. But really, I think that claim is based on a lot of speculation, not a great deal of data, and we wanted to sort of unpack that in a little bit more detail. So in this figure, what we show, again on the vertical axis is changes in birth cohort over time, is the proportion of people who attended different universities in their career. So there's a number of important trends. One is the kind of general rise of the number of people that are going to university in the British elite. But what is striking is that this blue line in the middle, which captures jointly both Oxford and Cambridge, remains really quite remarkably stable. About 30 to 40% of the British elite have attended one of those two universities, which is a very large overrepresentation given the number of graduates that studied here. But this perspective is very partial in a particular way, which, as the top black line alludes to, there's been significant changes in the structure of higher education in Britain over this same period. And so to really understand, I think, the power of these two universities, what you'd need to do is situate this against some other group. And what we do is we compare them to those individuals who have never been to university. So we're saying, what's the likelihood of getting into the elite, having gone to Oxford or Cambridge, compared to those who never went to university? We also do it for a number of those other university groups that I've mentioned, just to kind of give us a sense of scale and comparison here. And when viewed through that lens, we see a different but slightly more complicated story. So the blue line here is going to Oxford and Cambridge. So again, what you can see is that compared to anywhere else, Oxford and Cambridge do remain incredibly powerful over this period. But it hasn't been a kind of consistent power. It declined in the early part of the 20th century before experiencing a resurgence in the post-Second World War period. So what we see is that, yes, these two universities really matter, but their power hasn't remained stable over time. But there's another aspect to this that I think is also really crucial, which is that coming to these universities may not work exactly the same for everyone. And we draw on C. Wright Mills's sort of conceptualization of the two Harvards to think about the idea that there are kind of two Oxbridges, which doesn't sound very easy. It's not very easy to say that. But the idea here is that for Mills, that within Harvard, there was a kind of a Harvard that was experienced by a closely networked group of old boys, and then the Harvard that was experienced by everyone else. And we do the same kind of analysis. We both look at people that have attended those Clarendon schools that I mentioned before, but also we look at people that came from wealth and whether their experience was different within these institutions. And we find that, yes, it was. If you attended, for example, one of those Clarendon schools, you are twice as likely to get into the British elite than other graduates of Oxford and Cambridge who went to other schools in Britain. So even coming here doesn't necessarily operate as a kind of meritocratic clearinghouse. There's something else that operates within these institutions too. And maybe the final thing to point out within the university space is that Oxford and Cambridge themselves are not necessarily entirely similar. Yes, they're lumped together very often in these kinds of analyses, but there are subtle differences between them. What's striking, I think, is that actually when you compare their relative power, they're actually pretty similar to each other. They both kind of, the likelihood of getting into the elite is roughly the same from either university, but the kinds of positions that you end up in is different. Oxford is perhaps a bit better in terms of politics and the humanities. Cambridge has been historically a little bit better in the sciences and other sort of more technical fields. So these institutions are really important and in many ways suggest the kind of durability of certain kinds of elite institutions, though not without some contestation over time. But this doesn't mean that there's been no change within the elite at all. So one dimension in which we've seen some movement, though perhaps not as much as we might like, is in terms of gender. So here in this figure, again looking at the year at which people have been included in Who's Who, we see the increase of women within Who's Who. It's risen from around 7-8 percentage points in the late 1980s to sort of just under 30 percentage points among the most recent additions. So we're still not really anywhere near parity in that respect, so a long way to go. But what's also striking here is the differences by race as well. Black and Asian women have seen much smaller absolute improvements than white women in particular in terms of getting into these elite positions. And what's, I think, really striking when you talk to these women in our interviews is that their experiences are flanked by misogyny in many aspects of their careers and lives, and we can talk a little bit more about that if you're interested. But this also pulls out, I think, the kind of the dimension of race and ethnicity within the British elite. So this is offering a slightly different perspective on that question, thinking about ethnic categorization over the very long run, again using birth cohort as the kind of position around time here. And so there has been some movement among Asian British elites, in particular in the kind of most recent cohorts. But what I also think is striking is that there's always been a presence of both black and Asian communities within the British elite. And this is partly to do with the role of empire. So at the very beginning parts of this graph, what you have is people, for example, who are at the top of the Indian civil service, who are included in Who's Who by virtue of their position in that incredibly important administrative bureaucracy. So empire looms in the background of this analysis too. So although the elite has changed in some respects, we also, I think, draw out the persistence of elite reproduction. And I think for us, at least, this raises a question about the performance of ordinariness. If elite narratives of kind of Britain opening up, of meritocratic legitimacy are somewhat of an illusion, why is it that elites are so keen to come across as being ordinary in how they present themselves? And our answer is that there is, as Sam's already mentioned, a distinct market for ordinariness. And to explain what we mean by this, we want to kind of turn to the public presentation of people's or elites' cultural selves. And here, Who's Who is really quite unique, because not only does it have this kind of rich information about schools and universities, it also captures information about leisure and recreation activities as well. So there are a number of, I think, fascinating storylines here, but we're going to pull out just two for the sake of brevity. So what this figure tries to capture is the different kinds of things that people say when asked about what are your kind of leisure and recreation activities. The red line, again, we're using slightly different periods of time here for sake of clarity in the analysis, but this probably gets a little bit confusing. But in the middle here, we're talking about the decade in which people turn 20. The red line here is the proportion of people who only mention highbrow tastes. So things like going to the theatre, opera, classical music, that kind of thing. And what you can see is that it reaches its peak in the kind of people that came of age in the middle of the 20th century before it wanes slightly. Alongside that waning is the rise of what we describe as popular or everyday pastimes. Things like spending time with family, walking the dog, being with friends. These things become much more popular and prominent among the entries within Who's Who through the second half of the 20th century. Now you could think that one is replacing the other, that there's a kind of waning of highbrow taste that's then being replaced by this more ordinary and everyday orientation. But the story we see is slightly more complex than that, which is that when we start to think about these activities in combination, how they operate together, something seems to be slightly different here. So in the middle of the 20th century, it's true that the kind of dominant mode of elite distinction, elite cultural distinction, is people saying things like, I enjoy classical music, theatre, and opera. But by the end of the 20th century, this red line comes to dominate, because now people are saying things like, I enjoy theatre, opera, and spending time with my family. So this shift, I think, is important because it reveals a kind of different mode of elite distinction. Now, we might view this as being evidence of elite omnivorousness, as kind of a much more relaxed approach to cultural distinction. But there is, in our view, the kind of residue of a highbrow, perhaps even snobbish orientation, which we also detected in many of the conversations that we had with the people that we interviewed. Though this can often be carefully veiled. And what I've got here on the board is an example, suitably anonymized, so you couldn't find this person, of both someone that we interviewed. So we've got on the left-hand side their Who's Who profile, where they talk about enjoying running, visiting old churches, shouting answers at TV quiz shows. And then on the right-hand side, what they're able to express in the privacy and anonymity of an interview, in which it's very clear that highbrow culture is incredibly important to their sense of self and who they are. So these findings leave us with two kind of linked questions. Why is it that these people are so keen why do they struggle so hard to come across as being ordinary in terms of background and also in terms of taste? And then second, why is it that this kind of performance of ordinariness seems to have emerged? What happened perhaps in the late 20th century to elicit this sort of shift in how elite cultural distinction is being performed. And our answer is that successful expressions of ordinariness represent a distinct cultural currency. But to get at this, we conducted two different experiments. The first is an experiment with the general population. And what we're interested in here is to try and uncover how people responded to different kinds of elites they might encounter. So we ran a few of these, but this is just one that I'm going to share with you here. So in this scenario, on the vignette on the left, we introduced this sample of people that we sent this survey to an academic they come across on TV. This person comes from a working class background, and that sort of informed their research. On the right-hand side, as you look at the slide, it's exactly the same scenario, except this person's father was also an academic, and that's informed their work. And we're interested in how people respond to these two different individuals. And what we can see is really quite striking, that on average, the middle-class academic is seen far less positively than the academic from a working-class background. So the middle-class academic is seen as less intelligent, less hardworking. The research that they're doing is perhaps less useful to everyone in society. There's even a sense that they might be like slightly less competent. They're a better researcher than others. But crucially, the biggest effect is that they think that, much less likely to think the middle-class academic would listen carefully to someone like me. These results basically play across each of the vignettes that we ran. We ran one for a judge and for a CEO, as well as an academic. So this kind of gets at maybe this idea that there is a symbolic market for ordinariness, but it doesn't necessarily tell us why this shift may have happened. And to get at this, we ran another experiment, this time with the people in Who's Who. What we did there is we wanted them to imagine that they were going on that radio show that Sam mentioned earlier, Desert Island Discs. So for those of you that may not have come across this before, Desert Island Discs is a radio show that's been running since, I think, the 1950s. Influential people, famous people are asked to go on, and they said, we want to imagine you're going on a desert island. You can take a set number of tracks with you. You can only listen to these songs for the rest of your life, and you also get to take a book that you can read for the rest of your days too. Now, we changed it slightly. We said we wanted you to imagine one track and one book. And we asked this question to the people that we surveyed. We also asked them for the reason why they picked the track. We wanted to kind of get at their justification for why they would take it. But crucially, for half of the people that we asked this question, before we asked that question, for half of the people, we also asked them this question. And what we were trying to do here is prime the salience of rising income inequality, which has gone up a great deal since the late 1970s. And so what we were interested in is whether elites that we surveyed for this project, whether their responses to the desert island disc question changed, given that we primed the salience of high levels of income inequality. And what we find is, small but significant differences in how people answered that question. Basically, the people who were exposed to that inequality treatment become less likely to say that they would take a classical piece of music as their track to the desert island. They also change the kind of book that they would pick. They become much less likely to say they would take something like Dostoevsky, for example, and they try to be a bit more funny in terms of their responses. So what we draw from this is a sense that rising inequality has potentially ramped up the need for elites to perform ordinariness and to do that perhaps in culturally distinct ways. So why does this matter? Why does this kind of performance of ordinariness have any importance at all? Why do we care? And I think one answer is that many of these processes could affect both the elites that we get, but also how elites think and the degree to which they're ideologically coherent. What we find is that when we surveyed these responses, there are distinct differences between these different communities. So, for example, elites from middle-class origins are more right-leaning on a range of political questions that we ask them. There's many more that we could draw out here, but I've just for the sake of simplicity, I've presented a few here. But it's also true that women tend to be more left-leaning within the elite than men who are in the elite. And here it also comes through really clearly the importance of the wealth elite that Sam spoke about before, because wealth elites are also far more right-leaning than other elites, less wealthy elites within Who's Who. Now, there are a bunch of limitations that are present in the analysis. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking these through. I'm sure that your questions will draw some of these out. And for the sake of time, I'm going to move into the conclusion and just wrap up. So the basic message that emerges from our analysis is that the contemporary British elite is increasingly interested in trying to present itself as ordinary. And one of the ways that it does that is by drawing a distinction with an aristocratic past, a kind of closed, snobby, socially exclusive elite that existed at the beginning of the 20th century. And yet, what we argue is that this performance of ordinariness really operates to shore up the legitimacy of the elite, because the public are more sympathetic to elites that can convince others that they come from more disadvantaged backgrounds, perhaps, or they come across as culturally ordinary. Those kinds of elites are seen as humble and more down to earth. And for us, this is where one of our unique contributions of the project kind of emerges. Certainly others have talked about elite ordinariness, but what we're able to uncover is the value of that and how it operates within this symbolic market outside of elite circles. But we argue that this process is pernicious, at least in part because it strongly contradicts the reality we've been able to document empirically within our analysis. So despite what elites may tell us about how Britain has changed, what we find is that elites today, in many ways, remain a snobbish, socially exclusive formation. And not only does our analysis kind of underline entrenched inequalities, but it also suggests that this influences the politics that we get. And for us, this is maybe where the sort of second key contribution comes out. Because much, I think, of the discussion around elites has often focused on who they are, and we think it's really important to try and move beyond that. We think it's important to consider it, but to move beyond it to also capture what elites think and what they do. And this connects us, I think, with other debates in political sociology and political science. And so if elite reproduction has been stable, and this affects the politics we get, what could we do to alter processes of elite reproduction? Now, I think it's fair to say, and hopefully this isn't disparaging to anyone else in this room, but I think we feel as sociologists that we're not always the best at coming up with policy solutions, but we gave it a try anyway. And so let's see what we think. So for us to maybe break the link between wealth and access to elite positions, we would potentially advocate for an annual wealth tax of around 0.6% on those with more than 2 million in assets. This would not include their main home. In addition, to undermine the power of elite schools, we would restrict the number of privately educated students at Russell Group universities to 10%. 10% is the proportion of 16 to 18-year-olds that have attended a private school. So you basically bring that in line with the population average. But we also think we should reform admissions at Oxford and Cambridge, because the people in power 30 years from now probably shouldn't be determined by interviews with Oxbridge dons. And so to open up Oxford and Cambridge to a more diverse set of students, we would eradicate applications and actually randomly recruit in the population as a whole above an attainment threshold. And part of the reason for this is that currently only 12% of students that get top grades in the northeast of the country apply to Oxford and Cambridge, whereas if you look in London, it's closer to 42%. So there's big inequalities regionally just in terms of top students who actually want to apply to come to this. We think this would kind of reverse that process and actually say to, say these institutions should go out and say, we want you to come here. So these reforms, I think, are kind of meaningfully trying to remake the channels of elite recruitment and reproduction. And this effort, I think, brings me back to the beginning, to Henry, with whom we started. And our key argument is that when people like Henry downplay their advantage, when they deflect privilege, when they diminish their economic power, they are, intentionally or not, obscuring the very real differences in wealth and opportunity and power and influence between themselves and everyone else. Thank you very much.
Great. So much to discuss in a really fascinating presentation. So we're going to open it up to the floor for questions.
Thank you very much for the fascinating and inspirational presentation. And I was thinking, two small questions. One is about your core claim about downplaying and pushing back this idea of being elite. And I think this was making me think about Rachel Sherman, but I'm sure you have discussed that in your book at length. But I was thinking about the fact that it's not just elite, it's also people like Narendra Modi who do not come, the Prime Minister of India, who do not come from elite backgrounds, who would actually downplay. So this whole controversy on him being the chai tea seller, right? So I'm just trying to think, like, if you expand the idea to other contexts, what it would look like. So and what does it say about the elites as well? The second is more a sort of methodological question. So my understanding is that if you are part of the who's who, you stay on the book or until you're dead. So how do you then sort of take into account the influence then that has on the kind of actual influence of elite that they are able to navigate into different spheres? I don't think that's clear.
Should we answer straight away? Great question, thank you. Shall I start with the first one?
Yeah, I'll do the second one, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think, so I'm fascinated, I suppose, by this idea, and I think you see it certainly in politics in lots of different countries, a kind of, like the sort of premium on a sort of upwardly mobile trajectory. I think there's an obvious reason why it has a particular appeal in politics, where you are sort of heavily dependent on an appeal to everyone in the country, that if you can show through your kind of life story that you have these kind of anchoring points in different parts of the population, that's going to be attractive. So I think it's a really interesting sort of additional question that we'd be fascinated to know whether there's a symbolic market for ordinariness also in other countries. Perhaps it's true. I think the only slight sort of counterpoint to that is that when you look at studies of class identities in different parts of the world, Britain stands out quite distinctively with a real kind of popularity of working class identities. So I showed you that stat of people identifying as working class even when they come from fairly privileged backgrounds among elites. We see that more generally in the UK population among people from middle class backgrounds. Whereas in terms of lots of other countries, people often go the other way. So people will subjectively identify as middle class, even when they're from fairly disadvantaged backgrounds. So that would be the only wrinkle. Whether there's a particular symbolic market for deflecting privilege in Britain, I don't know. It's an empirical question, but I'd be fascinated to sort of know whether that would be the case in other countries.
Yeah, and to your second question, absolutely. I think what we're capturing, I think, is a group of people who at least have been in their lives members of this British elite. What we're not claiming is that everyone that's in it right now is currently the most powerful people in the country. However, what I would say is that we've interviewed people across a range of different ages. Some are kind of maybe on the more mature end of that sort of age spectrum. And I think we were struck repeatedly by just how influential people that maybe were like post-retirement continued to be, how they mobilized their influence in ways that I think suggest to us that once you're in, maybe your kind of day-to-day power diminishes somewhat, but your access to elite networks doesn't necessarily just evaporate overnight. So I would say, certainly there's probably some downward trajectory, but it's from a very high set point. And so it doesn't just, there's probably a point maybe with like, illness or et cetera, where it really could like disappear. But I think for lots of the people that are still active, it's pretty striking.
On that, what you often see in the interviews is the people sort of cashing in their positional careers for positions, symbolic positions, on boards or in sort of philanthropic environments, charity settings, where they can still exert quite a lot of influence based on the kind of previous positional sort of career.
Or becoming masters of Oxford colleges as well.
Exactly right. Yeah.
There are lots of these sorts of positions.
I think well into the 70s, and some of the interviewees in their early 80s still kind of being quite influential. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, I got four people. There's a lot of questions. Robert was first.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. It was a delight, and also the methodological base of impressive. Like, I often have the impression in sociology there's studies where I can believe them, and then there's studies where I have to believe it, and it doesn't feel matter. I guess
You're right, you have no choice.
It does. Yeah. So, but my question is: so you painted a picture of a relatively coherent, ideologically relatively coherent elite. I'm wondering. You mentioned Stuart Mill's, Bourdieu's in the background. And I mean, there's always the thinking of horizontal class conflicts, different class fractions within the elite. Could you maybe spell that out and how far we might be seeing also conflicts between actors who are maybe not so well positioned to perform ordinariness? So who is able to authentically really perform that? Are there different fractions? Is there a pushback against ordinary elites within the elite? And maybe also zooming out to the US case, are we maybe, this is just speculation, but are we seeing there, we've talked about it earlier a bit, are we seeing maybe a fraction of the elite taking a more dominant position now within the elite that kind of leaves ordinariness behind and stuff?
Yeah. I think there's a lot in that one. Is it all right to answer that first? Yeah. Shall I start and then you go in, or do you want to start?
Let me start.
You start.
So I'll just say something. So actually on the ideologically coherent point, it's actually, I think we would argue that it's a bit more fragmented. So part of what we're getting at, pardon?
We've got a slide of
Yeah, probably somewhere, but it's going to be, it's hard to, is that it? No, I don't know. Okay, we have a lot of these slides at the background. Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
There it is. Okay. So actually what we do in the analysis is we try to get at clusters of like ideological, patterns of ideological preference. And what we find is basically three groups. So there's what we call maybe like progressive left. These are people who are very critical of empire, kind of anti-racist in orientation, very worried about inequality. Then there's a kind of establishment right position, which is the opposite of that. And then there's this sort of more centrist middle ground we call the New Labour left. They're sort of pro-growth, kind of mildly concerned about inequality, but definitely want to have more tax and spending in terms of public services. And so within the elite, you see these three fractions. What marks it out is that the wealth elite are much more likely to be in the establishment right than in the progressive left. And for us, what I think this captures is actually explains a lot of like recent British politics, right? Like you see this contestation over what it is that Britain should be at the moment, because we see a rise, particularly among younger elites, like newer cohorts, of this like progressive left orientation. So I don't think it's totally ideologically coherent. There is contestation within the elite from these different fractions over what it is that Britain should be. But that is linked with these sort of demographic factors that we gestured towards, so class background, gender, to some extent ethnicity too. And obviously wealth is like really, really important. So yeah, I think there is contestation. I think it isn't completely uniform. And in terms of that bit about ordinariness, actually maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, but it's interesting you mentioned the Bourdieu point, because there's a bit sort of long-standing debate of whether there's a capital composition axis in British society, i.e. is there a strong distinction between elites, for example, like in places like this, versus, you know, in the City of London, sort of economic versus cultural fraction. But one of the interesting things that I think we've sort of argued actually in a book chapter is that one of the reasons why we don't see as much of that distinction in our data is something to do actually with the channels of elite recruitment. So what's interesting about our elite private schools is that they're remarkably sort of able to deliver their old boys into both the cultural and the economic sort of fractions. And, you know, in the interviews, you get this strong sense that those schools don't really discriminate. They don't have a sort of snobbish sense that they want their old boys to go into particular elite domains. And really what their job is to find what you're good at and then sort of make you feel special for your ability in that and then propel you into those domains. And I think that, in a way, which you don't see, for example, in France in the same way, is perhaps one of the reasons why we don't see the same obvious capital composition sort of dimension. And you'd be, you know, it's striking that when you talk to people who work even in the City of London, there's still a sort of, especially among those who've been to these elite schools, there's still a sort of residue of kind of interest in highbrow culture and things like that, which maybe you would not see quite in the same way among the business elite in America, for example. But I think just on your America sort of link, I mean, that's maybe our point about distinguishing the wealth elite. Not only, we can see that among those who combine positional power and extreme wealth, it's them that seem to sort of tilt to the right. And we can also see that, the sort of business-orientated professions have grown as a group, as an occupational sort of group within the elite over time as well, yeah.
Okay, so we've still got over half an hour for questions. Hopefully we'll get to everybody. So first of all,
thank you for the talk. I was really interested in the data point where you were saying inequality, like the Desert Islanders, when they learned about inequality, then they became like new labor. But within the wealth elite, did you come across in your interviews anything around service? Because I'm thinking in the American context, when we think about W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, and this idea of the talented tenth, the talented tenth of the black population, whether they were wealth or cultural elites, had this responsibility to bring the rest of the race up. That still continues today. So if you go to the United States, that talented tenth, they're still philanthropic and they're still involved potentially in anti-racist work. And I was just wondering whether within the wealth elites, did you find in your interviews this idea of service to, I'm thinking, poor British people? I mean, just to make the comparison.
Yeah, the sort of noblesse oblige sort of idea of elites, but no. In short, I don't think in terms of that. One interesting orientation to that, which we were a bit surprised and we didn't totally know how to interpret, but when we asked elites what their main sort of policy priority would be, the one that came out the most among elites was education. And when we looked at that and looked at the national population on the same question, the national population said health. And you could, I suppose, argue that there's a dimension. Lots of these people are investing in private education, and yet when they think about what the state should be doing, they still believe in the power of education. And you could say implicit in that is the idea that education is a vehicle for upward mobility. So there's perhaps something in that. I don't know if you want to add anything from the Katie paper.
Yeah, I was going to say the only small thing would be we did a specific study of like what we might think of as broadly minoritized elites within Britain, and I think that orientation was present among some, but not all of the elites that we spoke to.
I wonder with like left-leaning women, maybe.
Yeah, so I think you get it. So definitely left-leaning women. There's certainly a bit more, I think, of this sort of orientation, but I think our interviews didn't necessarily touch on that kind of question so much, but it did come more through the kind of black and Asian elites that we spoke to, and they spoke very specifically about, or some did, I should say, the kind of anti-racist work that they do. But it is true that black and Asian elites did have they took different stances to that work, and one of the things we observed was that was partly linked with like class background. So particularly, black and Asian elites who come from working class backgrounds had a much more critical anti-establishment posture in terms of their work. That was less common among those that came from maybe more affluent backgrounds.
Right in the back.
Just a comment, because you had a graph which showed the Oxbridge dip in the early part of the 20th century. Does that account for the fact that so many people, young men, died in the First World War? And it wasn't until they died and actually they couldn't fill the beds in Oxford and Cambridge that the government stepped in to subsidise universities. So was that accounted for in your graph, or is that something that needs to be accounted for in your graph? In fact, there wasn't a dip other than the fact that people were supposed to be here with dip.
Yeah.
And then, sorry, just a second corollary. Your university proposal, I mean, people who go to Eton already, more than 20% go to American universities. Now.
Sure.
They'll just flee. You won't be successful in that sense.
Yeah. On the first question, yeah, the analysis would account for that. The thing that I think the account we offer for what's going on there is that in the middle part of the 20th century, you have a cohort of young people who are going to Oxford under a kind of particular ethos of what that institution meant, which perhaps wasn't so focused on academic excellence. And then what happens in the sort of post-Second World War period is they emerge into a workplace that's becoming increasingly organized around, the kind of large-scale productivity concerns that were operating in the background, and a sort of rise in this sort of like quote-unquote meritocratic impulse. And what you see very quickly, at least in our data, among kids that were going to these universities, is that their orientation to studying changes a great deal. And the private schools beneath them are also doing that work. And so our view is that you have a kind of crossover, cross-pressured generation that just sort of... Transitional. Exactly. They sort of came out into a world that they weren't really prepared for, and that didn't succeed as much. But that quickly corrects itself when the kind of elite institutions around privileged kids realize that this is a new game and we're going to ramp ourselves up for it.
Yeah, and then just quickly on the proposals. I mean, I think these were supposed to be provocative. We actually had an interesting meeting with the heads of admissions at Oxford and Cambridge about it. They very politely told us why they wouldn't be doing it. But I think you're right. I mean, there's both the issue of, wealthy parents flooding particular state schools to sort of recreate private schools in very expensive neighbourhoods in cities like London. So I think you would have to think about that, a policy agenda around that, as well as the idea of people going elsewhere. On just the America point, I mean, I think that's probably right to an extent, but I don't know, I'm not sure. I think there's a sense in which people are fairly nationally bounded in that regard. It's quite a big step to go to university in a completely different country, particularly if you are ultimately intending to return. And so I think it would that would be quite a radical change for it.
The argument I've heard is, I'm paying £53,000 a year for this boy to go to Eton.
Yes.
I'll just carry on paying, and I'll just do it at Harvard or
Yeah.
Stanford.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's a fair point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think we would think that. I think we're not naive enough to think that these reforms are going to just radically solve all of these issues, right? Yeah. But what I do think is interesting about what Sam says is that if they're going to Harvard, there is, I think, an open question about whether they come back and become part of the British elite in the future. And I think that's less likely, right? Because actually they're probably going to meet partners, they're going to be embedded in a kind of a careers network that's going to be very American focused. And so I think that trajectory might also change. But the other thing that's going on within these schools that's different is also their intake has changed significantly too. It's also become much more international. And so, what proportion of that 20% are also already kind of internationally mobile in terms of where they're going to school. So I think there's some questions there that we need to pass out. But I think there would be a meaningful change in the composition of these universities as a whole if you made some of these moves. And I think that's the thing we're going for.
David?
Yeah, well, I think you made a very good case about the elite, the reproduction from Oxford and Cambridge. But don't you also need, if you're making rather more general conclusions from this research, don't you need to look at the actual structure of the British elites and how the elite structure has changed? For instance, how the banking structure has changed. I look, for instance, at the directors of the main banks, and that's changed over time. A lot of the banks are now recruited internally. So again, that would have a very important changes in the nature of the people who are actually running things. If you look at the corporations, the structure of corporations has changed. It's now, in relation to the last point, it's much more international than it was. And again, a point which you yourself have made in terms of the role of the empire, you look at the civil service, for instance, the role of the civil service has changed to what it was. Foreign civil service hardly exists at all. The nature of the armed forces, it was a major element in the elite structure at the beginning of the 20th century, but it's hardly any influence at all now in the elite structure. So I think what you have to do is you have to say, well, this is what's reproducing in the Oxford and Cambridge system, but outside, the elite structure is changing somewhat. I mean, there are new elites like the cultural elite, for instance, the show business, the sporting elites. And in the sporting elites, I know in the football industry, there are hardly any Oxford and Cambridge people. Yeah. They don't run football clubs. They may go to, some of them may go to public schools, but certainly among the players, hardly anybody comes from Oxford and Cambridge.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to start? Yeah, I mean, so I think we have looked at. I don't know. Again, I think we maybe got a. I don't know if it shows over time, but.
Not over time.
Not over time, but this is the occupational composition of the current version of the British elite. So, I mean, you can see, I mean, some of what you said absolutely shows up in our data. For example, if you look earlier, these two groups, for obvious reasons, right? The empire and, the influence of the church. At the start of our period, these groups make up a huge, or much bigger proportion of the elite. And we've seen a big expansion of other domains, including business. So I think we can see a little bit of that. The really specific dynamics of changes within particular types of organizations, I think is a good point. I don't think we really observed that. But I think, yeah, I mean, just on the sport point, I mean, one of the, I suppose, sort of things that people debate about entry into Who's Who is that, they're very much trying to capture sort of people who've had a sustained impact on British society, and so a lot of sports and show business people don't get in because they're not seen as having a long enough shelf life, right? So Gary Lineker is in there, right? But Raheem Sterling won't be in there. Maybe Raheem Sterling will be in there in 20 years, but because of a much shorter career. At this point, it's not clear whether he'll still be influential in 20 years' time. So that's a kind of one of the kind of wrinkles there.
Yeah, and just one small thing. I think one of the reasons we, at least in the main presentation, pay less attention to this sort of occupational structure is that we find a pretty remarkable consistency in the ability of perhaps wealth as a background, or even Oxford and Cambridge with some subtleties as we've talked about, in terms of getting into like all of these domains. It's not that there's a very clear association that very wealthy people are just showing up only in law, for example, or even business, that actually is pretty well spread out across the sectors. And so it just becomes, at least in the story we're telling, slightly less significant. But it is absolutely true that there's been structural change in the elite in general.
I mean, just in sport, for example, football is, I think you'd be absolutely right. But then you also have things like the Olympics, which are absolutely, Team GB is dominated by public school entrance, so yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. And I have some questions coming from someone that doesn't study class. And so first it's maybe very, I don't know, old school, I don't know. Not old school, how would I say? I mean, what would you think about using the term owning class? And if that is different to elite? And if that is not useful or something. Then I wanted to ask you about, you were saying that you divided people by position, looking at their position, or that's how the Who's Who is doing. And I wonder if the role, if these would be considered roles, is it useful to see the kind of more than, or if it's the same position and role, the position they occupy, the role that they do to maintain their position, if it's the same or different. I don't know if that's useful. Then I was very interested in this ordinariness. And well, I've just listening to you, I was thinking, well, maybe everybody's ashamed of their class. You have the accounts of how many people would, I mean, maybe working class people might be more satisfied of saying I'm working class, but you have all these accounts of people wanting to be middle class, and then the middle class being a bit embarrassed about being middle class. So everybody seems to be having a very difficult relationship with their class origins and position. But it seems this ordinariness of the elite, the richest, or the owning class, is almost responding to the kind of upbringing that is needed for someone to occupy those positions. So I wonder, like the shame that is embedded in being that rich or that powerful or that wealthy. And I wonder if you come across in your interviews with the impact of their emotional lives in their formation, like the isolation. I mean, you just need to imagine what would a person need to go through to become elite, you know. So because not babies are all born the same, right? So then something happens, and they maybe I think isolation might be a really strong thing, cutting off relationships with parents, not being cared by the parents, or maybe not wanting their mother to be anywhere near them, or you know, I don't know, or friendships, or you know. So how is it that this? I don't know if you come across something that tells you like, what's the sort of
mechanism, yeah.
and social sort of connectedness of these people. There's a sense of somewhere where, because they claim for this ordinariness, so there's a sense that they need to do something to be liked.
Yeah, yeah.
But then there's an awareness they're not liked. And I just wonder if there's some, I just find it really fascinating. And I wonder, how is it that people become that? I mean, what does it take for you to think you are the one who deserves that and who is willing to treat other people really badly and think so badly of others to sustain your position or your role? Anyway, many questions. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Whatever. I mean,
Shall I start? Thank you. These are really great questions, and I'm sort of trying to grapple with them as you say them. I think we tried in the interviews to get at this question of, because I think the first thing to say is, even among the people who go to the very top Clarendon schools, still a fairly small proportion of them are going to get to elite positions, right? It's not like, we're not talking about everybody or even anywhere close to a majority of people. But when we talk about sort of how it takes place, you know, what was distinctive comparing interviews with people who had been to these kinds of schools and elites who hadn't was the particular institutional apparatus and the role it plays in kind of what we call in the book scaffolding specialness. And that is often, as I mentioned before, about this idea that early on in the schooling, there's this sense of like trying to encourage somebody to find what they're good at, but what they're good at and interested in can be very broad. But once that is identified, like the school doubles down in terms of its infrastructure in supporting that, the pursuit of excellence in that area. And that can be across all sorts of areas. You know, hence the sort of acting royalty and the, you know, if you hear Benedict Cumberbatch or other actors talking about the role of their very expensive theatres and the role of ex-teacher, you know, there's a kind of sense in which you are, the school is scaffolding that sense. And then when you ask, what's the X factor that is the difference between somebody who becomes a very successful professional and someone who gets to the very top position, there is perhaps something around that type of sense of specialness, you know, sometimes people call entitlement, that comes through that type of schooling. Just quickly on the kind of, you talked about some of the emotional wrenching. I think traditionally in Britain, boarding schools had a particular role in cultivating a particular type of individual where it's exactly as you mentioned, that there was a kind of intentional idea that you're trying to pull the individual away from their parents in order to kind of work on creating a particular kind of emotional being that could, you know, could rule. And actually I was just part of a Radio 4 documentary on that, where they go into the psychology of that and the potentially quite harmful effects of that in the longer term emotional lives of those people. It wasn't so much what we looked at here, but I think it's a really interesting issue.
I'll maybe just say something briefly about the other points that you made. On the question of liked or not liked, I don't know if we would have data to kind of pass that, but I think what they do experience is a sense of being like legitimate or illegitimate in their position. And they want to feel legitimate. And one of the ways that they can reinforce that legitimacy is by doing this work of ordinariness. And how that plays out emotionally, I think we'd probably have to do a bit more work to sort of understand that. But I think they don't, I mean, my impression is that they're not isolated. They seem to have quite rich connections with people, certainly people of their own position in society. In terms of this first question of like owning class, I think we wrestled a lot with terms, actually. And I think one of the reasons we went with elite rather than actually a notion of class is that we wanted, I think, to retain empirically the possibility that they weren't a class in the sense of being ideologically coherent, in being kind of for themselves. And I think we're not sure. I think this is speaking for both of us. I don't think we necessarily see the elite as a class, but we do see them as a group of people who have disproportionate access to and control over particular kinds of resources, and that marks them out. And this comes back to the second point that you made about position and role, and I think we're very focused on position. I don't think we spent a lot of time in the interviews analysing this notion of like role. How do you actually perform that? What do you do in your job? How do you kind of what kind of functions are you performing in that role as a result of the position that you hold? So I think that's an open question for us too. But those just very briefly on the great questions. Thank you.
Okay. Let's stack 3 questions. Well, it's a lot of questions. So let's stack 3 and then we'll see if there's any more time. So somebody right at the back.
Sorry, talking too much.
Yeah, so first, thanks a lot for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. Looking forward to the book. I have 2 comments. When you conceptualize the meaning of the left and the right in advance to try to understand like the ideological elements of the elite, I'm not sure if I agree with the way that you're conceptualizing both ideological positions, because some of the issues that I saw were, for example, economic growth. Like if you favor economic growth, you would classify them as right-wing, and if they favor reduction of poverty, you would classify them as left-wing. And I don't know if those issues like that really can really tell us what the right and the left mean. I think a lot of left-wing people, including myself, would agree with economic growth as an objective, and a lot of people on the right would also agree with the reduction of poverty. Maybe the disagreement is about more on how to achieve it, right? And my second comment is related to that notion of the performance of ordinariness. And I think there was an element that was ignored in trying to explain the question that you asked and try to understand how that happened, right? How that performance of ordinariness came to happen. And I think the element that was ignored is modernity, right? Because I think that one of them, or 2 of the main elements of modernity are precisely democratization, which in itself means the government of the people, and the word populus in Latin itself means the popular classes, so there's obviously an attempt to claim legitimacy there. And at the same time, modernity was very much about replacing privilege for meritocracy, right? In the French Revolution, in the National Assembly, there was a massive debate because sorry, we're going to leave it at that.
Okay, great. 2 good questions. So
Thanks, that was so interesting. I was just wondering, if everyone is sort of tending towards omnivorousness, what are the contemporary markers of this class? And when you go to institutions like Harvard and Oxford and you speak about the internal sort of the 2 Oxbridges, what are the demarcations then occur if everyone is sort of emulating the same ordinariness?
Okay, and then we'll just take that question.
I was wondering, like in your interviews and when you look at data, how do you exactly measure influence? And in relation to that, how do you differentiate between the self-perception of people when it comes to their influence and the perception of the public of them and what kind of influence they have? Also because some people might have certain positions, as you said, or take positions after retirement, but that in itself doesn't really tell us whether they still have influence or whether this is kind of just a position to, add to their title, versus others who might not have like very prominent positions but actually exert a lot of influence. So I was wondering how you try to measure those.
Sure. Do you want me to do the first one? Sorry, sir?
Yeah.
I'll try and do the first one very briefly. So, the way that we do the analysis is we run a latent class analysis. So we don't come in and pre-specify the particular configurations of the answers to the questions and how they hang together. So what we find in our analysis is that the question on growth is associated with its kind of cluster of other kind of right-wing, maybe more explicitly right-wing positions. So actually it's in the analysis that comes through. I don't think it's our ideological prior that drives that. And I think you're absolutely right. And the other thing that's important there is that even within that kind of left-right distinction, I think it's about priorities. So what we're capturing is that the most important thing? And I think that probably is true that people on the left might not say it's the most important thing over other issues that you might have seen on the list of possible choices that you could pick. And also this question of the broader trends. I think we're very sympathetic to this, actually, that we do think that one of the things in the background here is this sort of big shift in sort of democratization, the end of ascription. Those were harder for us to come up with like nice, neat vignettes to try and test. So I think we wouldn't want to diminish the importance of some of those trends. We certainly think they're in the background. Yeah, we wouldn't want to say they're not operating here, just that we didn't test them explicitly. So, which I'm trying to be brief. So.
Yeah. Thanks for the question about omnivorousness. Yeah, so I think the point to stress is back to that point Aaron was mentioning about sort of saying one thing, doing another. You know, what we were seeing across a lot of interviews was that a distinction between this kind of public projection of your cultural self, which is where this kind of carefully projected omnivorousness comes, versus often a much more self-consciously highbrow orientation to both, you know, traditional high arts, or a very discerning kind of orientation to popular culture, for example, that would still mark out probably how these people are in their private lives or in their own elite circles. And then I think in terms of the Oxbridge infrastructure, what was interesting in interviews there was perhaps some of the things you might imagine, right? The particular kind of social infrastructure that demarcates your experience here, whether that's clubs, societies, and the ways in which, or arts, the ways in which the types of networks and your sense of kind of the function of what you're doing at university sort of was different for those who had come through particular types of schools where there was literally a kind of awareness of the types of places that people like them would live in the city, the clubs they would go to, etc. And I think that sort of starts to get at why they have a very different experience ultimately.
And on the last question about influence, I think it's true. It's a really hard thing to measure, and I'm not sure that we are explicitly trying to measure influence, at least in the analysis. So Who's Who defines itself as capturing influential people, and they have a particular mechanism for doing that. But one of the reasons I think they focus on positions is that some people are influential by virtue of the fact that they run particular organizations, that there's a kind of organizational logic to their influence, that just by being in that position, they are able to shape the lives of many other people and therefore have influence. But the other way that it comes through, I think, is just and we have this in the survey and we have it in the interviews, is the way that people have access to other people that we would recognize as being influential. Now, whether they are actually able to influence in the kind of direct sense of changing some outcome as a result of interactions is kind of unclear. But what's very, I think, obvious is that these people do have the opportunity, at least, to exercise that influence when most of us don't. And maybe just one small example is, you know, we were talking to someone who's kind of on the end of their career, one of these older people that we were talking about, and in casual conversation mentioned like regular conversations with Rachel Reeves. Like that type of influence or access to influence is something that most of us just don't have.
Okay, we've got time for maybe 2 questions if they're quick questions. Okay, so one over here.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I wonder, like, as a sociologist, we're so, like, limited but also influenced by the idea of class and power. Of course, there are great lenses to look at the society, but do you think there are other different lenses to look at the society?
And then there's another question here.
You go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering, you know, many of these anti-establishment or the leftist elites, they also come from a certain background. And I was wondering if they generally end up challenging the status quo, or they by design are cultivated by status quo to show that we're open to dissent and critique, and it helps the establishment in redeeming its own problematic past, especially British elite. So is there an element of performativeness to even the anti-establishment types in the elite?
As you were so polite, I want to ask you.
Oh, thank you. So it's kind of a quick comment. It's really interesting to see that we see the reproduction of social class, but also the new theorization trend is this emergence in market of ordinariness. But my question is, how much is media actually accounted for in the emergence of symbolic market, right? So we see this kind of like dramaturgy of performance, that there's like backstage frontage. Even during the interview, it will be seen as kind of frontage performance. But what we are not exposed to is how they talk like amongst the elites. So I feel like this is a really interesting one. So because of media, TikTok, like we see politicians be on the front page a lot more. Even we sociologists approaching them was somewhat like facilitated by like WhatsApp and some like how we email them like to put up contact. So I was thinking whether this sort of like market of ordinariness, this populism, this trend of like bandwagon is always there, or is it something that's just being exposed more because of like the emerging of media? Like the modernity explanation is good, but also I feel like it's a bit more abstract and broad brush.
Okay, great. Okay, 4 minutes to answer.
Okay, I'll just do the last one because it's in my head. I think the point we're making is that the sort of market for ordinariness is something that is actually linked to the types of elite we're looking at here. That most of these people, part and parcel of their influence is that they are to some extent accountable to a wider group, public, and that sort of means that their legitimacy to some extent depends on how they're seen by that wider group. And I think, on that, I think if we were to look at purely economic elites who are not accountable to wider publics through a kind of organizational sort of mechanism, I don't think we would be seeing that ordinariness. And I think more generally, as I mentioned before in the last example, I think you're absolutely right in a kind of, we can even see in the somewhat backstage dimension of an anonymous interview a very different self-presentation. I'm sure it would be very different also if you were to see a kind of ethnographic backstage. Yeah.
You've got 2 minutes.
I'll try.
Sorry.
So on the genuinely challenging the status quo, I think it's hard for us to adjudicate that question. I think when you talk to those people, some of them are very prominent and actually people that you would perhaps recognize as being activists in certain spaces. And I think that they would take their work very, very seriously. But what they would also say is that they're operating against an existing power structure that just isn't, can't just remake it by will. And so I think that they would see themselves as working very proactively, very committed, deeply invested in certain changes, but not necessarily able to deliver on those as much as they would like. But I wouldn't want to say that there is none of that performance either, right? And so I think there's a kind of just a complicated thing to try and resolve.
The ones that Aaron was talking about tended to come from working class backgrounds.
Yeah.
So there's maybe something, I think, around what you were saying that we can see a bit in the data.
Yeah, and then very briefly, absolutely. There's many different lenses that you could take to even this group of people, not even just class and the way that we've sort of done it. And I think we've drawn out aspects of gender and race, but they're sort of part of the analysis in important ways. But I think you could do a much more focused kind of approach, and more broadly in society. There's a whole range of other ways of tackling these sorts of important questions around inequalities. And I think this is like the tradition that we're in, I guess. Yeah. So.
One of many projects.
So yeah, we can.
Thank you.